All right, guys. Sorry about that. My computer cut off on me, so we're just gonna pick up right where we left off. If this is the first video that you clicked on, well, anyway, I just take a look at your material page, and you'll see that this lesson had to be broken up into two sections. So, two sections of about 15 minutes each. Um, And when we froze, we were trying to find the $10 bill because on one side it has the Treasury building, and on the other has this guy, Alexander Hamilton, champion of the first bank of the U.S. All right, so moving on from the Treasury, why don't we talk about the Department of Defense, a colossal department. Of course, you've got the proud bald eagle clutching arrows. The mission of the Department of Defense is to deter war and protect the security of the United States. It was founded when Harry Truman signed the NSA, the National Security Act of 1947. This was as we were coming out of World War II. And the act merged the Department of War, which was one of the original cabinet positions, one of the original four. It merged that with the Department of Navy, and it created the U.S. Air Force. The new department was initially named the National Military Establishment, but that's kind of hard to say. National Military Establishment. So they changed it. Um, and now it's the Department of Defense. The first secretary of the DoD was a guy named Henry Knox, Secretary of War, excuse me. And then a man named James Forrestal, who was a fighter pilot in World War I, was named the first Secretary of Defense in 1947. Unfortunately, this is a very sad political story, but Forrestal committed suicide. He resigned from his position and he committed suicide. He likely had PTSD from the war. Other notable factoids about the DoD is a guy named Donald Rumsfeld. I remember him from George W. Bush's presidency when I was in high school. But he actually has the distinction of being both the youngest and the oldest person to serve as Secretary of Defense. When Gerald Ford named him Secretary of Defense in 1975, he was 43. Remember, Ford replaced Nixon. So Ford gets in. He appoints Rumsfeld Secretary of Defense. And then in 2001, when George W. Bush, appointed him, he was 74. So a 31-year gap in his age from the first time he was secretary to the second time. He has a lot of critics for how he handled his second tenure as the Secretary of Defense, but still, that is noteworthy that he served twice and that he was both the youngest and the oldest. Now for the Justice Department. Qui prodomina justitia secutetur, which, as we all know, means that qui prodomina justitia secutur, pardon my Latin pronunciation, means he who prosecutes for Lady Justice, or he who prosecutes for justice, depending on how you want to interpret it. The mission of the Justice Department is to enforce the law and defend the interests of the United States according to the law, also seek to prevent and control crime, and to seek punishment for criminals. It was established in 1870 when Grant signed a bill to create a Department of Justice headed by the Attorney General. The Attorney General was not a new position, but the fact that the Attorney General was going to now be the leader of the DOJ, that was new. Our first Attorney General was a guy named Edmund Jennings Randolph. He had been governor of Virginia. Remember, Virginia still is a very influential state, but during this era, during the early days of America, it was hugely significant. So if you were governor of Virginia, and that was a real hotbed for political and military leaders. A lot of them came up in Virginia. So Randolph, having been governor of Virginia, that gave him some good credibility, and Washington appointed him to be the first Attorney General. Our current Attorney General is a guy named William Barr. He has his critics that say that he is too loyal to the executive department, or the office of the presidency, I should say. The idea is that the Justice Department operates basically independently from the chief executive, but that's just not always the way it works. The Department of the Interior, what I think is probably the coolest seal of any department. The mission of the Department of the Interior is to protect and provide access to our nation's natural and cultural heritage, and honor our trust responsibilities to Indian tribes and our commitments to island communities. So, as its seal indicates, the Department of the Interior was established March 3rd, 1849, the last day of the 30th Congress, to handle domestic matters. Remember, when we hear the word domestic, when you hear it just in kind of everyday speech, it's usually referring to someone's household, domestic disturbances and stuff like that. But in this case, that means to handle situations or matters going on within the United States, as opposed to foreign relations. Zachary Taylor, who was president in 1849, he's the one who created this department. He named a guy named Thomas Ewing. Thomas Ewing had been Secretary of the Treasury under Harrison and Tyler. He was the first Secretary of the Interior. One fun fact is that hang on, guys. All right, guys, where were we? The Department of Agriculture. The mission of the Department of Agriculture is to formulate policy on farming, food, and natural resources, maintain food safety, and combat hunger worldwide. So it pretty much just handles food and natural resources. It was established by Abe Lincoln. Way to go, Abe. 1862. Initially, the Department of Agriculture was not considered a cabinet level department. That didn't change until Grover Cleveland was in office, and in 1889, Cleveland decided to turn it into a cabinet level department. In other words, raise its status on the executive, the federal bureaucratic food chain. This guy Norman Coleman, he got a law degree, but then he decided to go into farming. He was Secretary of Agriculture for less than a month, and then Benjamin Harrison replaced him. One of the most significant developments in food safety happened thanks in large part to a guy named Upton Sinclair and a book he wrote called The Jungle. The book was all about essentially how disgusting the meat industry was in the United States. And people read it and they were shocked at what they read. There was a huge public outcry, and the government responded. The government responded in 1906 with the Meat Inspection Act. It's pretty self-explanatory, but the idea is just to make sure that red meat or other meat, I suppose, that is being sold and distributed to the American people, just to make sure that it's safe. The Department of Commerce. The mission of the Department of Commerce is to foster, serve, and promote the nation's economic development and technological advancement. It was created in 1903, the Department of Commerce and Labor, that is, but the Department of just Commerce wasn't established like we know it now until Taft. Taft actually split labor and commerce in 1913. First Secretary of Commerce was William Redfield. Redfield was a New York guy, and Woodrow Wilson, then President Woodrow Wilson, appointed him as first secretary. First Secretary of Commerce and Labor was George B. Cortelyou. Cortelyou. So again, it started out as the Department of Commerce and Labor, and then they just broke it down into what we have now, which is a Department of Commerce and a Department of Labor. Herbert Hoover was the longest serving Secretary of Commerce. He was in the position for over 7 years. And one of Hoover's big things was this Own Your Own Home campaign. The workforce was growing. When Hoover also presided over the country during the Great Depression. He's certainly not remembered as a great success as a president, but as Secretary of Commerce, he is applauded sometimes for his work in helping first time home buyers in America, because factory jobs were blowing up. There were now new work opportunities for Americans, and Hoover and the rest of the Commerce Department tried to help people own homes. The Department of Labor, remember, formerly part of the Department of Commerce and Labor. The mission of the Department of Labor is to assure work safety, fair pay, and unemployment insurance benefits. It was established, again, within the Department of Commerce and Labor until 1913. First, William Wilson was appointed by Woodrow as the first Secretary of Labor. And one thing Wilson, that William Wilson is known for doing a good job at is mobilizing the workforce during World War One. To mobilize means to move or to get to move. So the idea is that William Wilson did a good job of getting our workforce up and running. And one way he did that during World War One was bringing women into the workforce and providing limited but increased opportunities for Black Americans to work in factories. Frances Perkins was the Secretary of Labor from 33 to 45. She was the first cabinet level secretary in U.S. history. And the Labor Department's building currently is named after her. Here she is, glamorous lady. We're going to finish labor and
Alright,
then we're
guys, I am going to physical science now.
Miss Hoover. Uh-oh.
Okay.
Hang on, guys. I hope
Orion, great job. I
this
see
is
you're working. Unless you have to get off your
Hoover.
for Aries. You've got
Hey, hang on just a
You
second.
might be able to
Miss
get that done.
Hey, hang on just a second, would you?
Ricky, I'll see you later.
Well, that didn't
Bye.
work, guys. All right.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye.
See you, man. That was chaos, class. That was absolute chaos. Tried to stop her, but I couldn't. So, like we said, we'll end with Miss Perkins, Secretary Perkins, pardon me. Frances, first cabinet level secretary in U.S. history. We've got quite a few more departments to go through, and we're kind of running low on time. In fact, we're just about out of time from our 30-minute limit. So I'm going to stop there. Sorry for the chaos right at the end of the presentation, but I was in a Zoom meeting on another line. So anyway, hopefully you guys watch this and hope you have an awesome weekend.